Yo, what's up everybody? It's your boy Laghima. Back with a new video. Sorry for the little hiatus. Due to kind of some classes and scheduling shit, I wasn't able to get to a video last month, but I got a new camera, as you can see, so I'm definitely going to be posting a lot more often, seeing as I don't have to do like those kind of crazy ass fucking edits. Anyways, today's video we're going to be covering music theory. This tutorial is more so meant for producers. If you're trying to be like an improv pianist or something, it may not be the tutorial for you. But anyways, we're going to be covering music theory as a whole. So I'm going to cover notes on the keyboard, how to make scales, the major minor scales. I'm going to cover modes. Then I'm going to cover how to make good chord progressions always, a surefire method that actually is music theory. It's not just some BS method I made up. Then after that, I'm going to cover the same thing for melodies, a good surefire way how to always make it melodies. And then lastly, or second to lastly, I'm going to cover jazz theory, and then I'm also going to show you some interesting ways just to make chord progressions better. So once you kind of get a good chord progression and you want to kind of take it to the next level, I'm going to show you a method to do that. So anyways, let's go ahead and get into it. So just so you guys know, I expect this video to be pretty long, so I'm going to put timestamps through it just so you can kind of skip to what part you need to get to. But anyways, the first thing I'm going to talk about is actually going to be the notes on a keyboard. So the notes on a keyboard can be broken down into two categories, which are the naturals and the sharps and flats. So all the naturals look like as follows. So C, D, E, F, G, A, B, and C are also all the white notes. And these are all the natural notes, and this just repeats throughout the keyboard. And we call this range from C to C an octave, meaning 12 notes, because there's 12 note difference between C and C. Anyways, that covers all the natural notes. The next notes we have are the sharps and flats. So if you want to know the sharp or flat of a particular note, what you do is you go to that note and you go up one, which we call a half step, and you'll see that C sharp is the sharp of C. And then also if I went down one from C, you would see that B is the flat of C. And this can be done for any note. So if I went to D and I want to know the flat, it's going to be D sharp. I'm sorry. If I want to know the flat, I'll be C sharp. If I want to know the sharp, it'll be D sharp. And that pretty much covers all the kind of note-based related things when it comes to music theory. So next thing to talk about is actually going to be how to make scales. So scales are just a set range of notes that you use to make your whole song. So for instance, when you make a song, you would choose the scale you're in and then start making the song. So the scales come in two different types. They come in major scales and minor scales. Major scales are defined as being really happy. Minor scales are usually defined as being really sad, or kind of on the somber side. Any major scale can be made using the whole, half, whole, half method or pattern, which I'm going to show right now. So whole, which is two half steps, one half step, two half step, then whole, half, whole, half. This is the C major scale. And if I want to make the C minor scale, I would just use the whole, half, whole, half, whole pattern, which is as follows. Or if you want a shortcut, and this is what I do, I just take the 7, the 6, and the 3 and bump them down a half step. And that way you'll get the C minor scale. So this is the C minor, this is C major. And as you see, the only difference is that I lowered the B, the A, and the E down one half step. So generally speaking, a lot of songs usually made in the more in the minor scale. I usually write in major. That's just kind of a personal preference. There's no real difference between the two. It just depends on what the song's going for. And that's pretty much how how scales are made. So the next thing I'm going to introduce is going to be modes. Modes are basically just kind of a special case of scales. So generally, modes are not expressed as major or minor. They're just modes themselves. You can think of them kind of almost like a neutral position. So there's 8 different types. I'm not going to name them all. I'm just going to kind of display them on the screen and the patterns associated with making them. If you kind of have some spare time, but definitely suggest you kind of go around and kind of mess with them. Personally, my favorite is Phrygian. It's used a lot of flamenco music. They also use a lot of trap. There's also some other modes, like I think Doran was using like Greek music back in the day. But generally each of them have their kind of own taste and feel. But just remember, they're not major or minor. They may have major or minor chords in them, but they're not themselves major or minor. So they're very distinct from scales. You would use them in the same way. So when you start out your song, instead of writing it in C major, you would write it in, for instance, C Phrygian. So that's just kind of a good kind of idea, kind of how to use them. So the first thing to talk about when it comes to chords is actually how scales work. So scales are not represented by notes, but in reality they're represented by chords. So for instance, in the C major scale, the first scale degree would be C, and this C represents the C major chord, and then D represents the D minor chord, then the E minor chord, then the F and G major chord, and I believe this is A diminished followed by the D minor chord. So this is for the major scale, and I'm gonna express it on the screen so that you guys can see it. And then for the minor scale, the first chord is gonna be minor, then it's gonna be diminished, then major, then minor, minor, major, major. So as you can see, these two scales are very different because, for instance, in this scale, when I have, for instance, F, right? For instance, F is the fourth scale degree, it's a major. This is F major, but in the minor scale, it's actually F minor. So these are two different chords. Even though they're represented by the same note, it's because of the syntax of both of the scales independently. And these, as you can see, these are both start on C, but because this is minor and this is major, they work very differently. So actually making chords is going to be the next thing we're going to talk about. So chords can be made pretty easily. They come in two types, which is major and minor chords. So any major chord can be made by taking whatever note you're at, skipping the next note in the scale, skipping the next note in the scale, and that way you're going to have your C major chord. And for the minor scale, all you would do is literally take this and drop the third. And now you have a C minor chord. And as you can see, the only difference between these two is that this E is here and this E is dropped. So these are both different chords, even though they start on the same note. I can't express that enough. That's like a huge part of the music theory of it. The next thing to discuss is actually going to be what we like to call extensions or chord extensions. So this structure here is called a triad, meaning three notes. But chords can be extended to what we like to call seventh chords, or ninth chords, or 11th chords. And all you're doing is doing the same pattern, going to the next note, skipping it, so forth and so on. The same thing can be done for minor chords, and there's no real difference. The pattern's the same. If I want to make a C minor 7th, all I'll do is skip the next note in the scale, and then go to the next note, so forth and so on, like that. So this would be like a ninth, a C minor ninth. So the next thing we're going to talk about is actually doing chord progressions. So this is where we're going to get into a lot of theory involved with chords. So for this example, I'm going to stick with a very simple chord progression and explain why it works, which is what we like to call a 1-5-1 chord progression. I'm going to do it in the C major scale since it'd be easy to see. So the first chord in C is C major because C is the first note and it's major. The first scale degree of any major scale is major. So that's the first chord is C major. And then I'm going to do the 5. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. This chord is G. And we know that the fifth scale degree of the major scale is major. So we know this is going to be a G major chord. So if I'm going to make that, and then I'm just going to bring it down an octave. So we have our chords. And then what I'm going to do is go from 1, 5, and then I need to know the next chord. So how do I know the next chord? That's going to be the main question. This is how you're going to end up making every chord progression by implementing this theory. So if I go to the C major scale, I'll see that I can, so in the C major scale, this is the first and this is the fifth. So when you choose your first chord in your chord progression, I'm going to go note this out real quick. The first and second chord you choose in your chord progression are arbitrary because you will always start on the one chord of whatever scale you're in, then you'll choose whatever chord you want to go to next. The third and onward chord is where you have to implement theory to know what chord comes next. So if I go to the G major scale, because remember this is the G major chord, and we know that the G major chord comes from the G major scale, and you'll see that the fourth chord is actually the C major chord. And this relationship is called a circle of fourths relationship, or relationship of fourths. And this works with every chord. Every chord, the next needed chord is always going to be a relation of fourths away. So if I were to play this, you'll see that this actually sounds good. And the reason that sounds good is because G and C have a relation of fourths away. And this comes from what we call the circle of fifths or circle of fourths. The new model is called the circle of fifths, but it comes from something called the circle of fourths. And this is the relationship I'm showing between these two chords. So any chord is like that. And I might have a display on the screen so that way you guys can see what I'm talking about. So if I wanted to do like another chord progression, say I wanted to go like 1 to 6, and want to know the next chord after that, I know that it's going to be 2, I believe, because the 6 in this scale is going to be A minor. Let me fold this real quick. So the 6th chord is going to be A minor. And if we go to the A minor scale, we'll see that the 4th chord that occurs is going to be D minor. So you can use this for all your chord progression. This is a surefire music theory method that isn't some BS shit that Busyworks Beats made up or something about numbers. This is actually what's going on inside when you make chord progression. This is how all chord progressions sound good. And the reason why it's the fourth chord instead of the 5th chord is just generally, you can also use the 5th chord, but it's traditionally always the 4th chord. Either can be chosen. So sometimes you may see that in your chord progression, you play the 4th chord, it sounds good, but the 5th chord kind of sounds better. It just really depends. Usually I believe the 5th chord is called a passing chord, which is kind of like a chord that's neither major or minor. Don't quote me on that. But that's how all chord progressions are made, and that's how you should make your chord progressions, by going from scale to scale and seeing what chord comes actually next by using the circle of fourths relation. So one more time, for instance, if I go to the C major scale, I choose any arbitrary next chord. So I start with a C, then I choose A minor scale, and then in the A minor scale, I see that, okay, well, the next chord is actually going to be D minor. And thus, this is a circle of fourths relation. If I play it, it should sound good. And then the next chord, you would go to the D minor scale and choose the 4th chord in that scale. I don't know it offhand. I usually always look them up. But that's all the chord theory necessary to actually make good chord progressions always. Another method to do if you don't want to kind of go through all the work of going from scale to scale is that you can just kind of arbitrarily choose bass notes. And once you get kind of a bass note melody that sounds good, you just build chords off of that. I've seen people do both. I prefer this method because it's a lot more surefire. So next thing I'm going to talk about is how to make your chords more interesting. There's a couple ways to do that, but the main way to do it is by doing something what they call chord voicing. So chords, any chord is just defined by its 3rd and 5th note. So for instance, I'm going to play the C major chord, and then I'm going to take out the 1. And as you can see, it still sounds like a C major chord. So the actual 3rd and the 5th really define the chord. So if that's still in the chord will sound like itself. That's why I can take out the 1, it still sounds like it's a C major chord. So the reason why I'm mentioning that is that when we move around the chord will still sound remotely the same, but sounding a little bit different. So for instance, the first thing I'm going to show you is something called an inversion. So what an inversion is you take the top note, or you take any note above the 1 and you move it down an octave. So this is what we like to call a first inversion. So then I can do something called a second inversion, which is when I take the 2nd note and move it down an octave. So that's a second inversion. Another way you can make your chords more interesting is also by just adding in what we like to call a 7th. So if I go to the 5, skip a note, this is a 6, and go up, this is a 7. So that we can see it adds a lot to the chord. There's a major difference between these two chords. Another thing you can do as well is you can take your notes, instead of bringing them down, you can invert them upward. So for instance, I can take this G and bring it up an octave. Something like that. Maybe even add a G back and go like that. And that way kind of make the chord a lot more interesting. Something else to do as well is make a 7th chord, but actually just omit the 1. So basically just don't use the 1 at all. Because remember, as long as the 5 and the 3 are in the chord, it's still going to be a C major chord. And you're going to chord that sounds like this. Maybe bring that down as well. Actually even add, let's see, add like a D in there. See, that's another thing as well. You can add in more notes. So generally just making the chord very compact is another way to get a lot of good elements from it. So something like this maybe would help. See, as you can see, that D added a lot because it's really close to this E here. So the main things when thinking about kind of making your chords more interesting is inversions, doing like maybe a first, second inversion, adding more notes in that may even not even be in the chord. So for instance, D is not in the C major chord, or technically it is. I think it's maybe the 13th, but it's not the traditional C major chord. So adding that D adds a lot to the chord. Also, spreading your notes out across different octaves. Another thing to do as well that I didn't mention is adding in a bass note. So for instance, I can take this E, bump it down an octave. So that E down here is just going to give the chord a lot more attention, a lot more seriousness to it. So anyways, voicing, adding bass notes, adding inversions, adding in 7ths and 9ths, and also doing omitting the 1 or omitting notes in general is going to give your chords a lot of different variations and different tastes to them. So that makes your chords sound a lot more interesting. So the next thing we're going to talk about is actually going to be melodies. So melodies are going to speak from chords that they're not multiple notes occurring at the same time. They're usually one note at a time. They can be more than one note, but generally speaking, they're just one note. So on the left side, I have a melody that I made, and on the right side, I have the chord progression that I made. So this melody is formed from this chord progression. And as I can show you, like here, the first section over here, the first bar, we have A occurring, and as you see over here, also A occurs. So as you can see that these two are actually the same thing, but all I've done is taken the top notes of all these chord progressions, and then I've made them into melodies. So this is generally my method for making melodies, is that I make a chord progression, then I take the top elements, assuming I have like a 7th chord, and then I use those to make melodies. Or even if I don't have like a 7th or 9th or higher order chord, I'll duplicate the bass note, so in this instance A, and I would use the other A. For instance, like if I bump this down, I'd have A0, and I'd have A, so I'd have something like this. And I'm going to use this A as a part of the melody and use this A as the bass note. And this is usually how it's done in trap music a lot of times, is that they'll have a melody, and on the top of the melody have bottom of the melody have a bass note that kind of carries the whole melody across. So what I'm going to do is play the melody, and I'm going to play the chord progression and then play the melody, so that way you guys can hear the difference between them. And then if I play the actual melody, you can hear it sounds very distinct and different, but it still has the same character of the chords. And actually, I'm going to take this and bump this down. So as you can hear, it's definitely a fine melody. And so what I would do from here is I would just add more elements, so maybe more notes, make it more interesting, because obviously this melody is rather boring. There's not really too much going on. So a couple ways to kind of add more to your melody is by adding things that are almost out of rhythm, or they're not in the normal phrasing that you made, which is another thing as well. Make sure your melodies are phrased. As you can see, this is a 1-bar loop. As you can see here, this is a 1-bar loop, this is a 2-bar loop, and this is another 2-bar loop. So all I'm doing is just phrasing out my melody. So what I'm going to go ahead and do is I'm going to add some extra elements to it just to kind of make it a little bit more interesting. So maybe I can make like a small chord here. So maybe like have this A occur. And then maybe arpeggiate it upward. Something like this. And then maybe have something that goes down here. So walk it down. So since I'm going to go to this E, I'm just going to walk it down to the E. And then maybe walk it down to this A over here. And then we'll look at this chord over here, this little chord. And let's see what we can do. I think this should actually be a G, I believe. Yeah. So as you can see, we get a very fine progression. We can probably move this around. Let's see what we can get out of this. Actually, I think the E was fine. So as you can see, we're starting to get a kind of a little melody occurring. So I can even take that little chord I made here and bump it over here, and maybe even add like an extra little note, like another G down here, and have that come in a little bit later, and we'll get kind of some more movement in our melody. Something like that. Obviously this element here is kind of a little weird, but the idea is there. So the idea is just adding more things to make your chord progression, or I'm sorry, your melody a lot better by adding in more notes, maybe adding in some sus chords or sus elements. By sus I mean sustained, and then just working with the phrasing a little bit more, adding more things. So. And that pretty much ends it for today's tutorial, guys. If you haven't already, make sure you go and subscribe. Definitely help me get my way up to 1,000. I'm trying to work my way up the game. Also, if you haven't already, make sure to go and follow me on Instagram and Twitter at Laghima Beats, spelled Laghima Beats. You can find all the good shit I do on there. I post updates on my IG all the time, stories, shit I'm working on, that shit. Also, stick around and subscribe. Like I said earlier, I'm going to be posting some new stuff. I'm going to do some like tape with improvisation stuff. I'm also going to be doing kind of like some kind of analog ways to make music, because as you can see around me, I have a lot of analog equipment that I use to make my own personal music. So I'm going to show you guys some techniques on how to do with that. And if you guys want to see that stuff, post in the comments down below and let me know. Also, if you have any questions, comments, or concerns about all the stuff I said in the video, post in the comment section down below. I'm really happy to hear what you guys have to say and, you know, kind of talk about music theory. So anyways, as always, nice to see you guys. Laghima out.